Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to another one of our contemporary China speaker series. Before we begin today's talk, I just wanted to give you a preview of our two final talks in the final 2 months of the quarter, and we hope you show up to those as well. The next one will be Scott Tong, who was the former bureau chief for NPR Marketplace, and he will be talking about his recent book, which traces the opening and reform of China through his own family. He's Chinese American, and he talks about it through 5 generations of his family, which should be fascinating. And we're going to have our final talk with a former policymaker and trade negotiator, Wendy Cutler, who was instrumental in negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so she will be coming and talking about, you know, what went down with the TPP and how it basically collapsed. And there should be a lot of interest given what's happening with trade currently. So we really hope you show up to those, and we will hope to plan another stellar lineup next year for the Contemporary China Speaker Series. So for today's talk, I want to begin with a quote, and I wanted to make sure I get that right, from John King Fairbank, who was widely known as the founding father of modern China studies in the United States. He said in 1948 that China is a journalist's dream and a statistician's nightmare, with fewer verifiable facts per square mile than anywhere else in the world. Now, 70 years later, I think China is basically still a journalist's dream. I do think their stats system has gotten much better than in 1948. Still imperfect, but the numbers are much, much better. And it is been my view that journalists have been essential to bringing the China story to a Western audience. And some of the best of them really bring the complexity and nuance to a Western audience that we otherwise just would not get, and they're the ones always on the front lines. And some of my colleagues, too, have been former journalists. They've been pounding the pavement for years and years, and what I like about what's happening now is that as China has changed dramatically, we're seeing a new generation of journalists who are experiencing China in a very different way, and really bringing hopefully a really accurate story of the most consequential rising power in our young century. And that's why I'm delighted to have our speaker today, Isaac, who I believe is a leading voice in this new generation of journalists. He spent many, many years in China, first with Newsweek, and then he went to DC to be the Asia editor of Foreign Policy. The key fact that I think you ought to know about Isaac is he has the rare distinction of being the few Americans, other than Dennis Rodman, who's been to North Korea more than once. So if you have any questions on North Korea, this is your chance. Without further ado, Isaac.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'd get the same question from a lot of Americans when I told them that I lived in China, and I'd get a different question from a lot of Chinese. And they were both similar, very big picture questions, sort of questions that I'd ask someone about a place that I wasn't very familiar with. So when I'd come back to the States from when I was living in China, people would say, so how's China? And it's a really hard question to answer. Good. China's good. Thanks for asking. The question that Chinese people would ask in China is China good or is America good? You know? 中国好还是美国好? This is a question that I got thousands of times living in China. And there's no good answer to that. You know, like, oh, they're both good. You know, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. And I was thinking about these questions as I was putting this talk together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through some of the challenges, the issues that we American journalists and foreign journalists have reporting in China, and then some of the issues and challenges that the Communist Party has in dealing with us. So I've put together 2 acronyms. The first is GOOP, because it's easy to remember and a little bit gross and uncomfortable. And these are some of the pitfalls that, as a foreign journalist, I have to be aware of. I can't avoid them, but I just have to be aware of them. So GOOP stands for generalization, oversimplification, opacity, and prediction. And I'll get to the Chinese side after that. But generalization is a good one to start with because I don't have to tell anyone here this, but China's a really big place. 1.4 billion people. And people in the States ask me, so what does China think? What do Chinese think about this particular issue? And it's an impossible question to answer. You know, if I had to say, okay, what do people in this room think about any particular issue? There'd be a multiplicity of responses. And I could make some sort of generalization, but it wouldn't be entirely accurate. Multiply that by 50 million, and you get trying to explain what's going on in China. So the challenge is, how do you present a story that's compelling and informative to Americans without leaving so much out that it's useless or it's inaccurate or it's misleading? So one example of that is just how we structure things for particular audiences. So if I'm writing a story, if I'm talking to a group of people who know China, I can say Changsha, and people know what Changsha is, all right? But if I'm writing an article for an American publication, I have to say the former Chinese leader Mao Zedong, who ruled China from 1949 to 1976. Different audiences have an understanding of it in a different way. If I'm talking to a Chinese audience, if I'm writing for a Chinese audience, I can talk about relations between Liaoning and Jilin. But an American audience won't care about that because it's not relevant to them. They want to have a general understanding of what's going on in a very, very important, very, very complicated place. So the trick really is to try to find that balance there. The other one is oversimplification. So why did the US fight the Civil War? A lot of answers to that question, but if you had to give a one-word answer, you could say slavery. The US fought the Civil War because of slavery. Is that true? Is that accurate? Yes. Is that a huge oversimplification? Yes. Is that misleading? A little bit, but if you have to give a one-word answer, it's a fairly good one to explain a very, very complicated situation. And so that's another part of the thing that, as journalists, we have to do about a place like China, about anything. If I'm writing a story, for example, about China's policy on North Korea, or what Chinese think about North Korea, I could say, well, many Chinese are upset with North Korea. Is that true? Yes. Does that leave out a whole lot? Yes. But if you're an American who knows very, very little about China, you're focused on other things, and you just want one fact that you can hang your hat on, it's not a bad place to start. So another example with that is about an issue of Communist Party control and how Xi Jinping makes decisions. All right, so if you're trying to explain why Xi Jinping is doing something, there's thousands of reasons. Just like with everyone here, if you have to explain why you did something, a lot of factors are going to play into it. Why did you eat lunch at 12? Well, I was hungry. Well, yes, but there's other things if you want to give a really full answer on that. But I was hungry is a great answer. It answers the question satisfactorily. So with Xi Jinping, if you have to boil everything down into just a very simple point, one thing you could say is Xi Jinping acts because of political stability. All right, that's, if you want to just do a very baseline understanding, you could say political stability is the reason why Xi does what he does. Every action that Beijing takes, that Xi Jinping takes, in some way plays into this idea of shoring up, increasing, protecting China's political stability. And that, on many levels, is the most important reason that Xi does things, and it's a good model to understand what's happening in a very, very complicated system. So I'll give some examples with that. Look through the lens of political stability, you can say, okay, what are China's interests in the Middle East? China has a lot of interests in the Middle East. China's a big place. Middle East is also a large place. But how does what China do in the Middle East play into political stability? So a lot of people think that China's primary concern in the Middle East has to do with oil and with resources. And I would argue that Beijing's primary concern when it comes to the Middle East is about terrorism. It's about how does Beijing use its relationship with the Middle East to reduce the chances of a major terrorist attack either in Xinjiang or elsewhere throughout China? So how does China's relationship with the Middle East affect domestic terrorism? Well, China's policies there could raise ire among Muslims, which could cause them to be more likely to want to support separatists, terrorists, freedom fighters in Xinjiang to commit an act of terrorism in the country. And there's a few steps there. It's a little bit, it's not a direct line, but it has a lot more to do with China's political stability and Xi Jinping's ability to hold on to power than issues of oil. So if there's a economic collapse, that's also bad for political stability? Probably, but there's still a step between that. And it feels more likely that a massive terrorist attack could cause that. Also, a massive terrorist attack is closer to China's relationship with the Middle East than messing up the price of oil. So again, huge oversimplification here. There's so many factors, but we're trying to explain what's happening with Xi Jinping, and this is a way to explain it. And that leads into the next point, the Geoo opacity. We are really playing without a full deck here when it comes to covering China. And that's especially true when we're talking about elite politics. There are so many really, really important questions that we don't have answers to, or we don't even have good predictions to, because there's so much we don't know and don't have access to about what's going on at the top of the party. So, the Central Military Commission is the body that oversees the People's Liberation Army. And it's run by two vice chairmen and chairman Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping's relationship with these two men is one of the most important relationships really anywhere in the world of any group of people, and is one of the most important determinations of the Communist Party's control over China, the party's control over the military, possibility of a coup in the PLA, China's ability to fight wars overseas. There's a lot of really crucial issues that come down to Xi's relationship with the two vice chairmen of the CMC. And yet we really have no idea whether or not these three men get along. We can try to sift through public pronouncements, policy proposals. We can see what Xi's body language is like when he's talking to these men. We can read statements they say that obliquely reference the military. We can talk to people who perhaps are at some point in the same room as these men and can give us tantalizing tidbits of possibly accurate, possibly inaccurate information. But we don't really know how these men feel about each other. And we don't really know how well they work together. It's certainly possible that they despise each other and can only be in the same room when they have to be. They can have a very, very tight relationship. Xi can have a great relationship with one and not the other. We really just don't know, and the information we're going on with this is very, very limited. Another thing is Xi's relationship with the Premier, Li Keqiang. So a lot of people who watch the space assume that Xi and Li have kind of a tense relationship, that Li is very much being sidelined. And that's a good explanation, and that's probably even likely. But we also don't know how these two men relate to each other, how they feel about each other. We don't know if Li wanted to be party secretary and at some point was trying to maneuver people who support him to overthrow Xi. We don't know if he never even dreamed about that. So there's a lot of these issues that are really just unknown to us. So when this announcement came out on Sunday that Xi was getting rid of, or that the party was going to vote to get rid of the presidential term limit from 2 terms to indefinite, that's very important, but no journalist, no foreign journalist was in the room when these conversations were happening. We were not able to see how this was negotiated. The sources that we have in the United States to cover American political events are so much better than the sources we have in China. A junior People's Daily reporter in Washington, D.C., within a week or two, can have better sources in the American political establishment than a veteran American China reporter. Because it's just a totally different political system. It's a lot more open here. And it's very, very difficult for us to actually get a sense of what's happening at those high levels. And this makes the P, prediction, very difficult. So a lot of what we're supposed to do in journalism, especially the analytical journalism that I write a lot of, is to try to predict what's going to happen in the future. And that's really hard. If it were easy, we could just go invest in the stock market, makes millions of dollars, kind of like know what would happen. It reminds me of Back to the Future, where Biff gets that book about who's going to win all the sporting events. You know, if you know that, you can make an unlimited amount of money. It's great. We don't know that. We don't have the ability to do that. Prediction is really, really difficult. So I'm going to do a vote. And I know I've done this in the talks I've done past days, but everyone be honest. Who here thought that Trump was going to win the election? Okay, so it's maybe, what, 10% of the people here, maybe 15? I certainly didn't. I was totally wrong. I was very, very surprised. The US presidential election was probably the most watched, most commented upon, most noticed political event in history. We had such an unbelievable amount of information on that event. And this was a yes-no. Is Trump going to win or is Trump going to lose? It's really hard to imagine a scenario when we knew more about the US election than we did right now. And we were wrong. Not all of us, but certainly more than 50-50. We're just wrong. Prediction is really, really hard. And we live in an open society with free flow of information where the journalists and political activists and really just regular people can go, if anyone wanted to 2 years ago, you can go interview thousands of people about what they thought about Trump and Hillary. And you still just can't know. So we have that in the United States. It's so much harder in China to predict about what's going to happen for the future. It's so much harder. What is China going to do about North Korea? Well, perhaps they will further cut off oil and energy supplies to try to push North Korea back to the table. Perhaps they will move for regime change in North Korea. Perhaps they'll send more support publicly and privately to the Kim family because they feel like that's the best way to protect their interests. But the combination of opacity and the difficulty of prediction makes it really, really hard to come up with a convincing answer as to both what they're doing right now and what they will be doing. Very, very tough. So those are the challenges that we face that are more on the side of how foreign journalists can do better in China. And now we're going to look at it from the other side. And the acronym for that is DOC. So dishonesty and distrust, objectivity, and control. So there is a lot of mistrust that American reporters face when reporting in China. Less, I would say, generally from Chinese people, but from government officials, from people affiliated with the party and with the government. And part of that is just plain mistrust. So I did a story several years ago about crystal meth, the crystal meth trade between China and North Korea. It was a very sensitive story. And I called a professor in a university near the border to ask for his comment on that. And he asked me if I was Chinese. I said I was not. And he said, "Oh, you work for the CIA?" And I said, "No, I don't work for the CIA. I am a journalist reporting a story on this." He's like, "Hey, send my best to the CIA." Then he hung up on me. So, it was striking, but not a completely rare or unprecedented encounter to have with a Chinese professor. He did not trust that I was just looking for information about this. He thought that I had other more nefarious plans with it. So there's a lot of issues that American journalists have to face, have to deal with that. The other part of it is that there's not the same commitment to truth, and I know truth is a loaded word, we'll get to that in the second part, but the party doesn't feel like it needs to explain itself. And part of the reason is that we are not its constituents. When you're an American reporter reporting on America or a foreign reporter reporting on America, the way that politicians stay in power is by pleasing their constituents. So someone will want to talk to you, they'll want to get their message out. The Chinese system doesn't work that way. It's very different. So there's very little advantage to someone going on the record and explaining their policies. So a lot of ways that could backfire. So even when you have Chinese officials that you meet who feel like they have a good relationship with you, who trust you, who feel like you're not going to burn them, a lot of times they have very little to gain by going on the record with you. I remember meeting a party secretary of a city, and I had a nice conversation with him. I feel like in a different context, in different China, he'd be very willing to go on the record. But what does he gain by me writing a story about him? Even if it's very, very positive, even if I just said really wonderful things about him, then people in China and his party comrades might say, oh, why is he toting up to the Americans? Like, why is he talking about this at all? We already have a press release about this. It's not beneficial to him. The other issue is the question of objectivity and objective truth and objective reality. So a lot of times people will criticize me or some of my colleagues and say, why do I not report the truth about China? Why am I not fair? Why am I not objective? So there's a lot of different responses to this, a lot of different thoughts. The first is, not to get too philosophical, but just a question about what news is, how it all works. So there's an American saying that dog bites man isn't news, man bites dog is news. All right, so if something keeps happening, it's not really news. So we've never seen a headline in the Washington Post, for example, that says, White House acted today like it did yesterday. Things are the same. Nothing to see here, all good, thanks. That's just not the way journalism works. There's problems with that. It does skew things. But there's a reason why people pay a lot more attention to storms and to wars than to reconstruction. It's something that feels different. It's sexier. It gathers eyeballs. So that's part of the issue with this idea of objectivity. The other is what media is supposed to do. It's supposed to call out, it's supposed to provide transparency. It's supposed to explain, all right, this is an institution that's not behaving correctly, so we're going to unmask them and show people what's actually going on. And I think there seems to be a lot of resentment in China that American media plays that role to a degree. And one thing I would add about that is that so much party media is relentlessly upbeat and positive about China. And ignoring for the second how misleading a lot of that is, they're presenting a narrative. And part of what journalism is supposed to do is to provide a counter-narrative to powerful narratives out there. All right, so if the Trump White House keeps saying, hey, everything's fine, American media's job is not to say, oh yeah, you guys are right, everything's great, thanks. It's to say, well, actually, here's the way it's not fine. So when the party says, hey, happy singing and dancing minorities in Tibet hold a pageant to show how happy they are singing and dancing, American journalists are going to be very skeptical about that. And they're going to say, well, actually, there's so much more to that story. People in Tibet are not just happy singing and dancing minorities. Let me try to tell you another layer, another piece about what's going on. The other issue is the question of what objectivity is and can we actually create it. So if everyone in this room had a really boring professor and he said, okay, your assignment is write a 1,000-word news article about Isaac's talk. No two essays would be the same. No two articles would be the same. And all of them could be true, but it's hard to know which is the objective truth. Maybe one would start with a comment I made about North Korea. Maybe it would be a comment I made about China and journalism. Maybe someone would write about my shoes. These are all things that can add to a picture of what's happening here. Maybe someone would mention about the Paulson Institute, about U Chicago. Maybe someone would say, oh, it was supposed to snow today, but it didn't. There's a lot of information you can add that's all true and that all builds a picture, but none of these there's no objective way to write about this. If we all did this together, we could all vote on who had the best essay and which was the most accurate, but there really is no answer to that. It's personal preference. It's, okay, who's the audience? How well do they know it? If I'm showing this essay to my parents, they won't need any context about me. They know where I'm from, they know what I've done. If I'm showing this to a stranger, that context would be helpful. So which of those is objectively more true? Well, there's no real answer to that. It's about the audience, it's about perception, it's about what we all bring to it. So that's the way I tend to respond to that idea, to that question of can we do something objectively? And then the other issue that I get with that is I was giving a talk at a Fudan journalism school a while ago, and someone said, okay, walk me through this. You're planning your articles on China. Do you have a quota of negative stories and positive stories? And what is your quota for negative stories and positive stories? And that's really not how it works. Part of it is a 好事不出门, the expression that like good news doesn't come out and bad news goes all over the place. But part of it is that my job is not to decide, and my colleague's job is not to say, okay, this story was too negative, so let's write another positive story. It's to say, oh, this is interesting to me. I find this fascinating. I can add value here. Or, oh, my boss wants a story on China, North Korea. Let me come up with an angle that feels less explored and that, that adds some sort of value, that lets me say something that I feel like helps. So it's really hard to do all of those things, but that's what we're seeking for. And then the final issue is issue of control. The party is very, very careful with its message because for a lot of reasons. One of them is that the Communist Party wants people to think that it's China. It wants to combine the two in the minds of people in America and the people in China so that there's an inevitability of Communist Party control. It's kind of like there's an old communist song, without the Communist Party, there's no new China. And that song, in the minds of people in the party, and some people in the party, is true today. Without the Communist Party, there can be no China. That's obviously not true. The party and China are not the same thing. But they're very, very careful with their message and how they present information because they want those things to be together. And this bleeds into issues of objectivity, issues of distrust, but there's a lot of examples of the party trying to control its message in a way that is both counterproductive and very challenging for people to write and explain about what's happening. And a lot of times there'll be these rules that people will suggest that you sometimes try to follow, sometimes you don't, but make it more difficult to present something resembling a comprehensive or compelling picture about what happened. And one of my favorite stories about that, this was a while ago, I think it was after the Soviet Union had just collapsed, and the Chinese ambassador to, I want to say Romania, I'm not exactly sure, flew back, and instead of bringing Chinese students back, he brought a lot of his nice furniture back from Romania. So there was a lot of stranded and upset Chinese students, and he got a new bed and kitchen set. So there was an outcry among the foreign media at the time to try to get access to this guy. And his spokesperson said, okay, the ambassador will take your questions. So the ambassador smiles, gets up there, and people start shouting questions at him. And he smiles, and then he walks off stage. The journalists are like, hey, what's going on here? The spokesperson said, oh, I said the ambassador would take your questions. I didn't say he'd answer any of them. So there's these things that you try to face. It's a little bit of a kind of like a schlocky stand-up joke, but it actually did happen. There's these things you try to face, these rules that you go against that makes it challenging to try to paint a picture of what's going on. So we have generalizations, we have oversimplifications, opacity, and predictions. And on the other side, we have dishonesty and distrust. We have this issue of objectivity, and we have control. And so those are the challenges that me and my colleagues often face when reporting on China. I still think it's a dream. I still think it's fantastic. It's a really fun thing to do. It's really enjoyable, and glad that I have the opportunity to do it. So, okay, so questions. Yes, and I think there's a mic. Oh, great.
Thank you so much for sharing. Actually, I have two questions.
Great.
The first is, how do you think the conflicts between United States and China, that they have a lot of common economic interest, but also they have a separate or very different ideology?
Yes.
Oh, do you want me to ask at once or?
Oh yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead and ask the
Yeah,
the
and my
question.
second question is, how do you think about the journalism rule in both United States society as well as Chinese society? Because from my point of view, the media in U.S. is more like a watchdog. Well, it's in China, it's more like a speaker or communicator between the bureaucracy and the citizens. And part of my view is that because China already have a commission of discipline that functions as a watchdog. Thank you.
Yeah, those are great questions. So there's an old expression, who will watch the Watchmen? This idea of if you give someone a lot of power, even someone who has the best intentions at mind, a lot of time the power will corrupt him or he or she won't behave in the exact appropriate way. And what American media believes, and I think you did a nice job of explaining the differences, American media functions as a watchdog. You know, it's more distrustful of institutions and believes that the institutions get better and that its citizens are better served by holding these institutions to task. Whereas media in China plays a very different role. It is a lot more like the corporate communications department of a major organization. It's trying to get its message out there, both to stakeholders, to citizens, and to other companies, and it's trying to paint itself in the best possible light. So I think they have very different roles. I think for America and for China today, in this case, America's system is much better. I don't think that for a lot of things with China and America, but I think that our media and the way we do things is more beneficial to Chinese people and also eventually to the party and to the government. And your first question, sorry, can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. What do you think about the conflicts between United States and China, that they have a lot of common economic interest, but very separate and different ideology?
I'm very optimistic by the, I don't want to say friendship because I'm not a diplomat, but Chinese and American people tend to really like each other. There's a lot of Chinese in America, there's a lot of Americans in China, and it's a fairly smooth relationship on an interpersonal level. I think a lot of Chinese like to pretend that they're not straightforward and direct, especially in the Northeast. You know, they'll say, oh yeah, like, you know, we're very subtle people, but in a lot of ways they're very direct and straightforward like Americans are. In a lot of ways. Kind of they're like, oh, haven't seen you in a while, you're fat now. It's like, okay, thanks. So there's a lot of things like that that I think bode really well for the relationship. On a much more somber note, the opposite is true of China's relationship with Japan. There is a lot of loathing that a lot of Chinese people that I've encountered have for Japanese people. There's this really strong desire for revenge that some Chinese have against the Japanese because of what happened in World War II and because of other factors. And that to me is a much more worrying relationship because it would be a lot more popular in China to go to war with Japan than it would in the United States. And that voice, that feeling really matters. Yeah.
So you've talked a little bit about how the language barrier between Americans and Chinese people can make it more difficult to do reporting. And of course, you're fluent in Mandarin, but there are many in China who don't speak standard Mandarin Chinese. And I imagine to get the fullest narrative, you have to speak to a lot of these people. So how do you handle that? Do you have interpreters, and does that pose a barrier itself when you have interpreters who are translating for you?
I think it definitely does. And I think it's hard to get the voices of people who don't speak Mandarin, especially if they don't speak English. If we don't have a language in common and I have to work through an interpreter, it's going to be a slower interview. It's not going to be as natural. They're probably not going to be as open. I'm not going to be as open. It's not going to have the same feeling. And I also might, so I have two choices. I can either talk to this guy who went to high school and so speaks some Mandarin, or this guy who didn't and doesn't speak any Mandarin. Probably going to speak to the guy who speaks Mandarin. I feel like it'll be a better conversation. I'll learn more. But then I'm not giving a fair share to this other voice. So it is a challenge, and I don't think it's one that I've handled very well. but I think there are other reporters who do a better job of really getting those voices that aren't really represented.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. I don't know if you have an answer to this, but I'd be curious to hear if you and your colleagues, if they are covering a story, and then say like a Chinese media or a Chinese newspaper is also covering the same story, if like that story ends up being drastically different, or you guys interpret it completely from different points of view, right? So I'd love to hear sort of, an incident if that's ever happened before. And then maybe also secondly, actually I forgot my second question, so you can just take the first one.
So I think we do often interpret things very, very differently. That happens in American media too. So when the whole Ai Weiwei thing happened, there was an American blackjack magazine that published an article, famous blackjack player, also an artist. And basically, Ai Weiwei, I don't know if the headline was something like that. Ai Weiwei made a lot of money in the States in the 80s and 90s playing blackjack. And in a certain community, that's how he was viewed, as a blackjack player, as opposed to these other issues. So depending on what your audience is for your publication, and Chinese papers have totally different audiences, a lot of them, than American papers, you'll focus on a different angle of the story. I will say that on the one hand, a lot of Chinese reporting on China is terrible, is party garbage. On the other hand, a lot of the people who write those stories are very intelligent, very sophisticated, very well-meaning journalists who know a lot more about these issues than I do, but can't write them because of their editors, because of the system in place, because of their own reasonable and very understandable feelings of personal safety. So some of the best sources I had in China were Chinese journalists who sometimes really wanted the information to get out there, but couldn't bring it out themselves.
Corruption?
Yes. In what sense?
The concept, both in the United States as well as China, as well as the implementation of measures to abate or remove the corruption in both systems.
I think it's fair, on the generalization area, I think it's fair to say that China is a much more corrupt place than the United States. There's a lot of corruption in America. There's a lot more in China. It's almost unhelpful to say that because it's such a broad statement, but if you're looking for a framework, that's part of it. I think the issue with corruption in China, especially with high-level corruption, is that we really don't know how corrupt Zhou Yongkang was. Zhou Yongkang was a former head of security. He was a standing member of the Politburo, one of the most powerful men in China, and he fell for corruption. And we read all these stories about hundreds of millions of dollars stolen and all these apartments and all these awful things that he did, but it was very, very difficult to actually know how true a lot of that was. It's believable, it passes the smell test, but a lot of that could have been cooked up by his enemies to discredit him. So the difficulty with reporting on high-level corruption in China, though Bloomberg, the New York Times have done excellent jobs on that, is that we have so little information about what's going on at the top of the party, and we don't know how much of this is accurate and how much of this is, okay, Zhou moved against Xi, and therefore they put out all this fake information. There's something similar happening with Guo Wengui right now, who's a Chinese billionaire. He's sort of a billionaire like Trump's a billionaire. Maybe he's a billionaire, we're not really sure. He's probably a billionaire, but he says he's a billionaire. There's a lot of accusations that Beijing has levied against him that sound credible, but it's very difficult to know if they're true or not. So sort of similar to the situation with Julian Assange, there's a woman who's accused him of rape. And it's very, very possible that he actually raped her. It's very possible that Beijing is using her and the story is false. It's very possible that he raped her and Beijing is using her. We just don't know. So it's important for us to try to ask these questions and to put them out there, but to put them out there explaining, hey, we're not really sure about this for this and this reason.
So the Chinese government has not only been trying to censor its own domestic media, but also now foreign companies like Facebook, Google. Just last year alone, I read that the Chinese government tried to ask approval to take down around 2,000 items. And so do you think this phenomenon basically poses a threat to not just like Chinese journalists, but also like American journalists in like publishing stories? And how should we interpret this exertion of China's like media territory, I should say? And
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I'm actually working on a book about Chinese influence in America and the way in which some of these things are now appearing much more in the United States. And to that, I would say there's a big difference between what China is doing in the United States and what Russia's doing. So with Russia, it's more about what's happening in America and American perceptions of American politicians. With China, it's much more about American and Chinese perceptions of China. They're much more concerned about the way that people here think about China than they are about the way people here think about the United States. I think you can trace that back to the idea of political stability. So American and Chinese perceptions of the Communist Party plays into political stability, whereas American perceptions of American political stability doesn't. And while there's certainly things happening on that sort of influence operation level that I don't know about, and this is common with all governments. All governments spy, they send people, they try to quietly make inroads and make effects, and I'm not quite sure what those are. But I think generally speaking, that's a big difference and an important distinction. The other really important thing to mention here is that when we look at what is happening vis-a-vis China and the United States, it's very important to be careful to distinguish the Communist Party from China or from the people of China. Not only because there's 80, 90 million Communist Party members and 1.4 billion people in China, but it's not fair or accurate to lump together these two forces or to say that because the party is doing something, Chinese people are doing it or Chinese people support it.
To continue on that theme, I wonder if there's a distinction between Putin's method of authoritarian disinformation and the Chinese method of information. That the Chinese regime seems to operate on, censoring things they don't like, but not so much generating fake news, whereas the Putin system seems to have a lot of information and to construct deliberate counter-narratives so that people just throw up their heads to spin in confusion.
Yeah, I would say that Beijing also constructs a lot of counter-narratives. A lot of what you read in, if we're talking about in the United States, a lot of what you read in China Daily or Global Times or People's Daily English Edition or you see on CGTN is a Chinese attempt to produce a counter-narrative. And a lot of times the counter-narrative is Beijing is acting in its best intentions and in the world's best intentions. And that she is behaving for the good of the country, the party, the government, and the world. So I feel like it's less, the counter-narratives, unless they directly affect China, tend to be less about America. But when they do, it's, there's a lot of China Daily articles about the U.S. behaving disingenuously on this issue of U.S. China concern, but China is actually behaving with integrity. So I think they do try to present this other narrative as well.
I have a quick follow-up.
Sure, go for it. Yeah.
A quick follow-up question about the censorship. You talked about briefly before.
Yeah.
I used to work as a journalist in China, and after I came here, people asked me, "So what did you do?" I said I was a journalist, and the first reaction they were like, "Aha, censorship. So you were not a real journalist." Well, I get it a lot, but also from what I understand, it's not a static line that you're definitely not going to touch it, and everybody knows. It's more just unwritten, and a lot of the times it changes. Yeah, over time it changes around the political cycle, but you never know where it is. So how do you, as a foreign journalist, how do you navigate, and do you take on calculated risks, or any experiences do you have had before?
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. You know a lot more about the way censorship works in China than I do. So I think that's a helpful perspective. I think for what I do, there's this analogy that a white man, because those two words matter in this sentence, a white man reporting in China reports with a ring of fire around him, where he is protected. but he very easily can burn the people that he comes in contact with. So the responsibility, I think what we weigh is how do we report with integrity? How do we not self-censor? And how do we not get someone in trouble for going on the record when they shouldn't have? And that's, it's a very individual conversation depending on the time. There's a lot of, I didn't do that much human rights reporting in China. I did some when I was there. And you always wonder if someone says, okay, I'm very willing to go on the record for this. You have to decide how comfortable are you that there's a possibility that the story you write about them will send them to prison. And is it your fault? No, it's the fault of the Communist Party for sending these people to prison for this. But you're still in some ways responsible. You can't just argue away your moral culpability there. So I think for a lot of issues of what's sensitive and what's not, we have to really consider our responsibility as ethical human beings. Yeah.
I'm just very curious, when that news about removing term limits was announced on Sunday, did it come to you and your colleagues as a shock that this specific agenda will show up at this specific time? Or you had some vague idea this might be coming this time? On related note, do you think that the U.S. intelligence agencies, they have better sources?
So what was the second question?
The U.S. intelligence agencies, do they have better sources for this stuff?
So first question, yes, I was certainly shocked. I wish I could say that I saw this coming, but I didn't. Or I saw something else coming and that hasn't come yet. So some people say they weren't shocked, and that's great, but I certainly was. And I really do hope that the U.S. intelligence agencies has better sources than we do. I mean, we assume kind of the things that you read in WikiLeaks were fairly low. They were American embassy officials meeting with Chinese officials, and you'd hear gossip about what was going on among top leaders. And I want to say that intelligence officials have sources in Zhongnan I don't know if that's true. It's kind of like you try to think, okay, what would be reasonable here, and then sort of expect that's the way things are, knowing that that's a very imperfect method for understanding it. I will say, though, that because there's things that are on the record and off the record, a lot of journalists, especially Chinese journalists, a lot of journalists know a lot more than they say publicly, because someone will say something very sensitive and they'll say, oh, this is off the record, and you don't repeat it because that's not fair and because you haven't verified it. So a lot of intelligence sources have a lot of information like that maybe it's not verified, but is valuable rumor.
Yeah, so I was wondering, as a foreign journalist, how do you convince those in China that the work that you're doing is not meant to try to weaken China in any way, that that's not your hidden agenda, that actually you're trying to expose things in order to improve the country?
I think I just generally, when it comes up, say things like that. And I think you use a nice summary of the issue. But I think my strategy for these things is to try to be very respectful in person. And even when I'm being very, very critical, to just do that in a nice and kind way and try to understand where the other person's coming from. So I think if someone knows that I'm there to weaken China, I'm not going to be able to convince them otherwise. And maybe they'll still want to talk to me because they will think that talking to me strengthens China. But yeah, I think just trying to be open and transparent about who I am and where I'm coming from, and then just listening.
I know you have lived in China for several years. Have you seen a change in the way how Chinese government control the information released to you, released to the foreign press? Is the party tightening the information control, or can you see a trend that the party is loosening the control? Thank you.
It's really hard to say. I think I was in Beijing from 2006 to 2011, and kind of had a vague sense of where the winds were blowing. And it felt like things were getting better and more open until the protests in Tibet and the protests with the torch running before the Olympics, and then things sort of clamped up before the Olympics, but the Olympics seemed very open, and then things were optimistic again. And then there was a financial crisis, but that was bad for the U.S. place in the world, so it felt like things were open a little bit more. And then it sort of just kind of keeps swinging back and forth. Before sensitive events, like before the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre and before party congresses, it's harder to get information out there. People are more likely to not want to meet with you. It's more difficult to get meetings. And I think this sort of cat and mouse game between Chinese censors and internet users, it's fascinating to watch, and it's hard to know, okay, who's winning? Term limits, people can't criticize Xi, so they send around this meme about Winnie the Pooh and hugging something he loves, and then that gets banned, and then this is allowed in and that's not allowed in. So yeah, it's really hard to know kind of who's winning and how that's all going to go. Okay, so one final question. Two more questions, okay.
Thank you. So you talk about the opacity of reporting elite politics, but increasingly we see a lot of reporting on that, like this booming industry of elite wealth. But then the fact that foreign media is involved in this kind of elite intrigue brings up the question of to what extent there are basically information fed into to news media. So to what extent do you think that is a problem, and what's the usual practice of dealing with it?
So I think there was a lot of suspicion that the Wen Jiabao story was fed to Barboza, the New York Times reporter, by enemies of Wen. And he said that all the information he got came from publicly available sources. It's tough because a lot of times in US reporting, people will leak you documents because they want to discredit someone. Someone in a conversation will say something bad about someone else in a conversation because they want their view to be the view that you remember, the more important view, and they want to discredit someone. So it's a widely acceptable journalist practice to take information like that, to be suspicious of the sources, but to take it. And I don't know if there's a good example of an American journalist who had a very damning document dump. I mean, there was a book a while ago about China's leaders. I think it was the 2002 to 2007 Politburo that was smuggled out of China. Andy Nathan wrote that book. And so that is information that might have been seen as to discredit these officials, but it's very, very valuable information. So I think it's that when we get this information, you want to use it, but you want to just be as careful as possible in knowing that the person who gave you the information is still giving you trustworthy information, even if their motives might not be trustworthy. Yes?
I'm just curious, who are your favorite writers on China? And do you have any recommendations of books or other things to read that may not be, front and center in the popular consciousness?
Yeah, it's not just because you're Australian, but Chris Buckley is fantastic. Yeah. Both the reporting he does and his Twitter feed. He does the best job of anyone I've seen of making boring Communist Party politics kind of funny. I don't really know how he does it, but he's very excellent on that. John Garneau also has done a lot of really excellent reporting on China. In terms of books, there definitely are a lot of excellent China books that have come out. I can come up with suggestions afterwards. Nothing's immediately coming to mind. I wish I read more in Chinese. There's so many excellent things being written in Chinese, in China, about what's going on in China, and that's a really excellent source too. All right, thank you all.